Okay, so we've been considering trophic levels, food chains, food webs. Let's now consider changes in how one trophic level in a food chain or web can affect other levels. And this is usually called top-down or bottom-up control, depending on what direction the effects are cascading through trophic food webs or food chains. So let's go through a specific example of this. This is part of figure 56.3 from your textbook in front of you right now to give a nice simple food chain to use as a visual backdrop while we're considering this concept. So let's consider top-down control first. Okay? So here we have a few trophic levels. We've got the primary producers on the bottom, the photosynthesizers, right, that are generating the food in the first place, right, converting light energy into chemical energy. Those primary producers are being consumed by the primary consumer, which in turn is consumed by the secondary consumer. In this particular case, a robin is shown, and consumed by a tertiary consumer. In this particular case, Cooper's hawk. Now, if there is top-down control, then we should be able to predict in this particular simple food chain what will happen if we remove the top predators. Okay, there we go. Cooper's hawks are gone. If there is top-down control in this particular food chain, what would you expect would happen? Well, there are no longer any Cooper's hawks if in fact it is top-down. This means that the effects cascade down to lower trophic levels. So the first trophic level that would be affected are the robins. In the absence of this predator, then, you would expect their numbers to increase. So the populations of robins, the secondary consumer here, will go up. There'll be more of them because they're no longer being eaten. And so in response to the increases in the robin number, then the secondary consumers, this will then in turn have an effect on the next trophic level down, the primary consumer. Now there are more robins eating the cricket, so this will drive the cricket numbers down. This in turn will affect the lower trophic level because now we have fewer crickets munching on the leaves, and so those numbers will go up. So the hallmark of effects when you have top-down control such as this is that you have alternating effects, right? Alternating between increase, decrease, increase, decrease, and so on as you go down the different levels if it's top-down control. Okay, does that make sense? Well, what's the alternative? Let's consider exactly the same example, but now we'll assume that there is no top-down control. Instead, there is bottom-up control, and we'll go ahead and try removing the top predator again just to consider what happens. Okay, tertiary consumer is gone. If it is strictly bottom-up control, what will we expect with the lower trophic levels? Well, not much, right? If it really is bottom-up control, then the effects only cascade up to higher trophic levels. Okay, so it depends on what's limiting the population numbers at the different trophic levels. So by definition, if this is truly bottom-up, then removing the top predator is really going to not have much of an impact. If that doesn't mean that the trophic food chain shown here would be completely impervious to any kind of perturbations, but ones that are strictly bottom-up. So for example, if we go in here and we do something to increase primary productivity, so we increase the level of nutrients, for example, we fertilize the plants, and we end up with greater primary productivity. We have more food then for what? The consumers. We would expect their numbers to increase, and this would then increase the number of the consumers, namely the secondary consumers who are eating the primary consumers. Okay. But that's an example of bottom-up control. So, are communities top-down or bottom-up? Well, they vary, and you can't always reason a priori what you would expect in certain circumstances. It can be a bit difficult to predict. This has obvious implications for conservation efforts. But you can tell if a community is bottom-up or top-down control from the way it responds to different perturbations. And there's a very nice example of this in your textbook considering what happened after the reintroduction of wolves in the area of Yellowstone. This is figure 56.8 from your textbook in front of you right now. and shows an example of a simplified version of the food web, of which wolves are a part. Now, there were no wolves in this area for many decades in the time period 1910 to 1995 or so, when wolves were reintroduced into the Yellowstone community because they used to be a natural part of this community. When the wolves were introduced, what happened to the various prey items that were then being consumed by the wolves? Well, they consumed coyotes, they consumed elk, and they consumed mule deer, and so those populations then would be expected to decline in numbers if this was top down, which in fact it pretty much is in Yellowstone Park. Okay, so those numbers would go down. What kind of effects would this have on the plants then? Well, we've got fewer elk and deer munching on the plants, right? So you would expect those plants to go up, and fewer elk and deer munching on the aspen, you would expect those numbers to go up. But if you look very carefully at this trophic food web, you can see there's another layer of complexity here, namely the effects of coyotes on beavers, right? If coyote numbers are going down, then that means beaver numbers are going up. Beavers are also herbivores and are chewing on these plants as well, so the effects of the beavers are going to drive the numbers back down. So we have two different competing effects then on the plants in this particular example of a food web, because some of the herbivore numbers are going up and some of the herbivore numbers are going down. So the overall effect on the plants then, it should make intuitive sense to you, depends on how much these different species are consuming, whether the overall effect is to go up or is to go down. So if you understand top-down and bottom-up control then, you should be able to connect this back up to a case that we already covered. So consider this as a clicker question then. Oh good, it's not too cut off. I scooched it up so it can be cut off here. So remember the amazing story of the lynx and the hares, right? The lynx were the predator, the hares were the prey item. For the example in northern Canada communities where there were these tremendous cycles going on with an approximate 10-year periodicity is shown here. So here is the graph to remind you of the population cycles in the lynx and the hare. And you hopefully will recall the treatments that were done by the ecologists that were examining the overall causes for that would affect the numbers of hares. And here are the results shown right here with the different treatments, no lynx, extra food, and no lynx with extra food, and so on, with the changes in hare populations. So, are these results, meaning this particular panel right here, are they consistent with top-down or bottom-up control? Okay, you've got three choices here. A, top-down, B, bottom-up, or C, both are operating in this particular trophic chain. If you're not sure, chat with your neighbors. I'll give you 20 or 30 seconds or so to think of an answer and click it in, then I'll check back in with you. Okay, everybody should have formulated an opinion and clicked in. Remember your answer counts on this one. You get more credit if you answer correctly. See if you guys are able to correctly figure this out. Ready? Let's see here. Well, half of you got it right. Absolutely, right? Okay, let's consider this again. No lynx. Right? What happens in the case of no lynx? The number of hares went up. Okay, that would be top down, right? Predator effects on prey number. Extra food. Numbers went up with the hares. This is bottom up, effects of food being supplied to a higher trophic level. So we've already got both here, and then here they are both at a time. So absolutely C is the best answer here. But we'll have another chance to click a question on top, down, and bottom up. So hang in there. We'll do another one in a little bit. Okay. So communities can be very complicated. They can have large numbers of species. This is one form of biodiversity, then having a large number of different species in one area. And so what are the consequences of having large numbers of species? Are there any benefits? Are there any measurable benefits to having communities that are very species rich, have very high levels of biodiversity when you consider numbers of species? Well, there have been a number of different kinds of experiments. This gorgeous picture from your textbook, which is figure 5713, shows some example of experimental plots at a very famous field station in Minnesota, the Cedar Creek Natural History Area, which has been the location where a large number of these studies have been performed in a way in which plots are specifically manipulated in terms of the makeup of the species. And for these particular experiments, the species that were manipulated were plants. And so they were open to the rest of the environment, so other kinds of species could enter and leave the plots. What was specifically manipulated and what was primarily quantified was the effects on the plant species. Anyway, the basic experimental design is shown here on the left, where there were a number of different plots. Only 3 examples are shown here. There were actually hundreds and hundreds of different kind of experimental plots. These were huge experiments done over many, many, many years by large numbers of people. And these plots are fairly large. You can see these squares are 13 meters on the sides, about 40 feet by 40 feet. And again, this picture shows some examples of these plots that were laid out in huge grids. And within these plots, there could be just one species. There could be a number of different species that were the same sort of general type, like both legumes or both cold season grasses or so on. Other plots had a number of different kinds of species or groups in them. And then they were evaluated over time in a variety of different ways, some examples of which are discussed explicitly in your text. But a quick overall summary of a very large literature is right here, which was that the results for these experiments, and this is the kind of thing that has also been corroborated with other kinds of experiments, similar kinds of experiments done in other locations, are that in general, areas that can be characterized by greater species diversity do in fact tend to have greater net primary productivity, which we discussed earlier, right? The rate at which light energy is converted into biomass. Areas with greater species diversity also tend to be more resilient to various kinds of disturbances, meaning that they tend to recover more quickly after some kind of disturbance or perturbation. And they're also more resistant to disturbance. What this means is in the face of some kind of disturbance, they tend to be less affected than a more simple plot with much less species diversity. So an example of a kind of disturbance would be an invasion by an exotic species. So the probability of an area being successfully invaded by an exotic species is lower for those communities that have larger numbers of species. That's a general overall generalization. There are some exceptions to this. But these consequences in general are considered fairly beneficial, and therefore efforts are usually made to try to preserve species diversity. When we're talking about preservation of species, then we're talking about conservation biology, which can be defined as the effort to study and preserve, and also to restore threatened populations, communities, and also ecosystems. So conservation biologists work at a number of different levels, as shown here diagrammatically in this particular slide. So conservation biologists are concerned with maintaining populations that are large enough that high levels of genetic diversity can be maintained within these populations. As you learned earlier in the course, very small populations are characterized by having low levels of genetic diversity, which can be problematic in the face of pathogens moving through the population, for example. So maintaining high level, large numbers of individuals and maintaining genetic diversity is an important issue for conservation biologists. And in addition, conservation biologists are interested in maintaining species diversity, which usually requires then protection of the habitats, because it is within the habitats that the species can all then coexist together. And maintenance and protection of a habitat then naturally includes the different members of a complex community, the plants, the animals, the fungi, and the microbes, and so on. So all of these things are considered by conservation biologists, and of course this is in contrast to something like a zoo, which is what some people think of when they think of conservation efforts. And certainly zoos are very important institutions for educating the public and also for doing research. But bringing a specific species into a fenced, concrete-lined enclosure is obviously quite different from maintenance of that species in a natural habitat. And so zoos are absolutely no substitute then for maintaining natural habitats where a variety of different species then can be protected and conserved. Now, there are some areas globally that have been identified as being particularly important or identified as particularly significant in conservation efforts. These have a variety of different names. There's a figure in your book, a figure 57-5, which is slightly different from this one. I'm showing you this one instead because it includes both terrestrial and marine areas that have been identified as so-called biological hotspots. So biological hotspots are noteworthy because of the very large the diverse number of species that live in the area, the large numbers of endemic species, meaning species that are not found necessarily elsewhere, the presence of endangered or threatened species, and so on. And you can see that here in Southern California, we certainly are in an area that is usually designated as a biological hotspot or an area that is high importance for conservation efforts. So the legal landscape for conservation efforts is that there is a Endangered Species Act, and this is what is used to identify and afford protection, at least legal protection, to so-called endangered and threatened species. So being endangered or being threatened are two different classifications for organisms, and so according to the United States Endangered Species Act, an endangered species is one that is, quote, in danger of becoming extinct throughout all or a significant portion of its range, and a threatened species is considered likely to become endangered in the foreseeable future. So this act is administered by different services depending on if we're talking about something that is strictly marine versus something that's terrestrial or freshwater. So it's either the National Marine Fisheries Service or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And if you go and visit the website of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the endangered species part of their website, then you can get all sorts of information on different endangered or threatened species. And if you click right here, then you can get the current list, for example. So here is the current list in the United States, and also some information on foreign outside the United States. And so some of these types of critters might seem familiar to you. If you check out some of these rows, it looks like annelid worms. We're doing okay. We don't have any endangered or threatened annelid worms. Look at this, snails, 35 different species of endangered snails, 12 threatened. Flatworms and roundworms, we seem to be doing okay on that. Zeros across the board here. As you scroll down, you can see the situation is different for reptiles and insects and arachnids and crustaceans and birds and so on. But anyway, that's where one can go for the current classification of different species if you're interested in locating information on that. Now, this level of federal protection started primarily after what happened to a very famous bird, and this is the passenger pigeon. This is an extinct bird, sadly. I would have loved to have seen one. It lived in North America. It lived in enormous migratory flocks. Here's a picture on the left-hand side from 1875 showing a picture of some individuals that are out hunting this flock. And apparently these birds were so common that you could see huge clouds of them darkening the sky. And so these birds did migrate around in North America. There are wonderful historical records, such as one flock that in 1866, as it passed through southern Ontario, it was estimated to be a full mile across and 300 miles long. So the rather astonished individuals in southern Ontario that were keeping track of this flock as it went overhead recorded that it took 14 hours to pass. Okay, so you can make a rough calculation of how long it is if you estimate how fast it's going and how long it takes to go overhead and so on. So this one flock is estimated to have had, about 3.5 billion birds in this one flock. Okay, so these birds were astonishingly common. In fact, they were one of the most abundant bird species on the entire planet during the 19th century. They were hunted for food, they were hunted for sport, they were used for feathers, for feather beds, and so on. Nobody believed that these incredibly common birds would ever go extinct, and yet they did. The last bird, a female who was named Martha, died in the Cincinnati Zoo in 1914 and is apparently now stuffed and available in the Smithsonian. That was the last individual of this species. And so this was rather startling to the individuals that directly experienced the transition from this very common bird to one that was now gone, and gone forever. And so this was the kind of event that was very instrumental in starting the federal protection of species, because it had been demonstrated that in fact species could become extinct. So it's not just the passenger pigeon, of course. There are a number of different species that conservation biologists are worried about, and in general the levels of extinction, the extinction rates globally are high enough that they do worry conservation biologists. And so this is why, for example, your book describes the current extinction rate as being on the same order of magnitude as some of the other major extinction events in the history of multicellular life. And as we talked about the Phanerozoic, you may remember there were 5 major mass extinction events, of which we talked about a couple in more detail. And current rates of extinction are comparable to the rates of extinction that did occur in those 5 mass extinction events, which is why many people consider that we're now in a 6th mass extinction event. So estimates of the numbers of species that are currently threatened with extinction. These are typical. These are the ones from your textbook. So globally, approximately 13% of the bird species, 25% of the mammalian species, and 41% of the amphibian species are thought to be threatened by extinction. So, why is this happening? And to what extent are humans doing something that is causing an increase in the extinction rate? Well, there are certainly many examples now that one can point to where humans have been involved in events that have directly led to the extinction of a particular species. And now this is getting the attention even of economists. And so this is a kind of a fun example of an article written from a business perspective, which is, how much is this costing us when we have species that are ecologically perturbed? Now, this article was clearly written not by a biologist but by an economist. There's 10 very interesting stories in here. They're not all invasive species. Some are invasive species. Some are just species where the numbers, there was a huge increase in the population size of a non-invasive species. But nonetheless, there's 10 very interesting stories within this article, which I will make available on the course website, which describe the cost and what's going on with human impact. So we're just going to go through one example of this. So here we go. This example is of a critter called the cow-nose ray. This is a individual marine creature shown right here, and looks a little bit like a stingray. It's a close relative of a stingray. It's not apparently a type of stingray. I'll just go ahead and read the quote that I've lifted from this book, from this article. Looking like a cross between an experimental aircraft and a tub toy, the cow-nose ray isn't something that most people want staring back at them from a dinner plate. But Virginia officials are trying to convince the public that the graceful animals, rebranded as Chesapeake Rays, are a delicious substitute for veal. This strategy is aimed at trying to protect the Chesapeake Bay's oyster industry, a once thriving business that has fallen on hard times. Unfortunately, getting there will mean dealing with the rays, the huge ray population, which has expanded because of the overfishing of coastal sharks. Keeps gobbling up the thousands of farmed oysters that wildlife officials have farmed throughout the bay. So here's a quick recap. Too few sharks equals too many rays equals too few oysters equals stingray fricassee. So this is a recipe suggestion from the author. Bon appetit. Okay? So, in other words, because of the way that humans are impacting the numbers of sharks, this is then causing these changes through what hopefully you now recognize as cascading effects through trophic levels, right? So here's your chance to try again. Let's do this as another example. Okay, so we've got 3 players here, right? And I've got pictures on the right for your convenience. We've got sharks, we've got cow-nose rays, and we've got oysters here, okay? So here's the question. If the overfishing of the coastal sharks, these guys up here, is the cause of a population increase of rays, these guys right here, and the population decrease in the oysters, these guys right here, would this be an example of top-down or bottom-up control within this food chain? 3 choices. Top-down, bottom-up, or clearly both are operating. Chat with your neighbors. I'll give you 20 seconds or so, and then I'll check back in with you. Okay, hopefully everybody figured this out and clicked in. Okay. I think we'll get 100% right. Let's see. Here's hoping. All right. Yes, 95%. Awesome. Okay, you guys have clearly nailed this concept here, right? So again, overfishing of coastal sharks. Numbers are driven down. It's causing an increase in the number of rays. Numbers are going up, causing then a decrease in the number of oysters, right? This kind of alternating changes going down through lower trophic levels then is classic top-down control. So nice job, guys. So, fairly obvious way in which humans do impact species and species diversity is from the loss of habitat by the way that humans impact the natural environment. So examples are agriculture, urban development, and forestry, mining, and also pollution. So all of these then have effects on the natural environment. And one such example is a biome that you learned about earlier, the wetlands. And it's estimated, for example, that more than 50% of the wetlands in the lower 48 states of the United States have been drained and converted to other kinds of habitats. Okay, this is a huge impact then on the wetlands in this country. And in our particular corner of the United States, here in the Southwest, where of course water is a huge issue water availability is a huge issue. It's estimated that over 90% of the native streamside communities have been affected by water diversions, changes in the water tables, invasions of non-native plants, and overgrazing. Okay, such that it is a very common sight in this part of the country to see things such as shown here on the right, where what used to be a natural stream is now, the water is now confined within an artificial concrete-lined culvert, as shown here. And I think when you compare a concrete-lined artificial conduit for water flow with a natural stream, it's fairly obvious what some of the huge differences are between these two different areas in terms of the species diversities in these different environments, what kind of species can exist under these conditions, and it should also make intuitive sense to you that what happens to the water and the surrounding areas is also greatly impacted by whether or not this is a natural setting or if it's an artificial enclosure such as this. As I mentioned before, the economists have become very interested in trying to put price tags on some of the effects of natural habitats from the point of view of human endeavors. And so these are sometimes called ecosystem services. And there are many interesting cases discussed in your textbook, which I'm not going to take time to go through now. I certainly hope that you work through these examples, one, because they're fascinating and important, and also they'll help you understand what is meant by some of these. But now the type of so-called ecosystem services that are provided basically free of charge by these natural areas in different parts of the country and the planet as a whole include such important things as purification of air and water, detoxification of waste, decomposition of wastes, effects on the cycling of nutrients. Even things like moderation of weather extremes are greatly affected by the percentage of natural habitat in an area that is being impacted by weather extremes. And another example, pollination. We discussed this very important attribute of angiosperm life as we were going through the different plant groups and talking about the dependence of many angiosperms on pollinators for their reproductive cycles. And this affects, of course, many plants that we care about because we eat them. And so one of the most extraordinary examples of pollination is discussed in your textbook. This figure is figure 5714 from your textbook, and shows a picture taken from an area in China where the natural pollinators have now declined to the point where orchards can only produce fruit if the workers in these orchards go around and hand pollinate all of the flowers, such as shown here in this picture. So holding a brush or a feather on a stick, then people can manually go to the male flowers that are producing the pollen and transfer those over to the receptive female parts of the flowers. And so this is after decades of pesticide use. Here's another picture. This is not from your textbook, showing the rather extraordinary labor-intensive efforts that individuals have to go to in this part of the world in order to pollinate the fruits in some of these orchards. So this has been, of course, studied very extensively because of the concern of what happens when the numbers of natural pollinators are no longer available. And I'm going to end with a final example of ecosystem services that some of you might not be familiar with, and that is the important role of plants in medicines. And fully 25% of the prescription medicines used in the United States contain substances that were originally derived from plants. So plants have a rather extraordinary wealth of different compounds, many of which are pharmaceutically active, and this relates to their role in the plants perhaps as defensive compounds, the actual number or fraction of plants that have been analyzed thoroughly for pharmaceutically active compounds is actually fairly small. The efforts to analyze plants in terms of providing pharmaceutical compounds is sometimes referred to as bioprospecting. But certainly an argument can be made that maintaining diversity in the plant species can provide potential benefits in identification of more medicinal compounds, but also maintaining different large species diversity in plants helps then retain genetic resources that can improve our agriculture or our horticultural plants as well. So this is actually where I left off in the 1 p.m. section, so I'm going to go ahead and stop right there. I wish you all a delightful weekend, and good luck on finals next week.